The initial years of Rare's history after the Microsoft acquisition were not great to say the least. The developer pushed out a few titles for the Xbox and Xbox 360 which critically were a mixed bag and commercially fared even worse. The problem seemed to be that without Nintendo's classic IPs at their disposal, Rare had to rely on original properties to draw in players, which is always a gamble. And for years, fans wondered, when were the famous Bear and Bird returning to consoles? They had a small handheld career after Banjo-Tooie, but they had yet to make their official Microsoft debut. But that was about to change as Banjo and Kazooie finally jumped onto the Xbox 360 in 2008, and nobody could have predicted the game that came out of it. In 2006, Microsoft and Rare announced that they were officially making a Banjo game for the Xbox 360. The development team consisted of several core Banjo designers, including Greg and Steve Males, Chris Sutherland, Ed Bryan, Steve Malpass, and Grant Kirkhope. Unofficially dubbed Banjo 360, the team was keeping silent about specific details, but a teaser trailer released later that year generated a ton of excitement. Gradually, as Rare showed off more gameplay, it became clear that the game, now called Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, was much different than fans were expecting. Instead of being a platformer, Nuts and Bolts featured Banjo and Kazooie building and driving around in vehicles, which, as you can imagine, got fans pretty angry. But why did Rare change the gameplay in the first place? Well, the earliest concepts for the project included both remaking the first game and designing a traditional platformer, but Rare thought this wasn't the right way to go. By this point in time, the collectathon genre had more or less grown stagnant, with interest shifting towards action, adventure, and shooter games. While some series were still doing well, by and large, collection-based platformers just seemed too old-fashioned, and Rare didn't think they could give the genre the jumpstart it needed. So they explored other ideas, eventually landing on a concept inspired by Lego sets, where players would create vehicles by placing parts together. The team soon had a prototype ready where Banjo could construct vehicles in real time and drive them around a level. And it required a lot of work to shape the building system into something that players could understand and create powerful machines with. Afterwards, the team got to work designing puzzles, scenarios, and worlds, and the end result was Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, released in North America on November 11, 2008. Since its release, Nuts and Bolts has been hated, made fun of, and disregarded by a sizable portion of the Banjo fanbase. While it received fairly good critical reviews, the general consensus among fans was that it was too different and lacked the platforming gameplay that defines Banjo-Kazooie. And Nuts and Bolts still stands as the most divisive game in the franchise. But does it deserve its bad reputation? A lot of the commonly cited issues are conceptual ones, where people hate the idea of Banjo using vehicles more than they do the vehicle system itself. And I'm here to say that Nuts and Bolts is unfairly criticized and has a lot of positive attributes that shouldn't be ignored, not to mention a lot of innovation. We've got a lot to unpack here, so let's start with the story. Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts takes place 8 years after the events of Banjo-Tooie, where life has been quiet for the Bear and Bird. The duo have become incredibly lazy and fat since their last adventure, spending their days chowing down on pizza and playing video games. But their peace is interrupted by Gruntilda the Head, who's returned to ruin Banjo's day. Before they can duke it out again, they're stopped by the Lord of Games, or LOG for short, apparently the designer of every video game ever made. By the way, I don't exactly know how to pronounce the Lord of Games abbreviated name. Some people say LOG, but I've always pronounced it as LOG, so that's what I'll be saying for this video. If you don't like that, well, I've already recorded the voiceover anyway, so too bad. LOG proposes a challenge that will decide who will own Spiral Mountain, with the loser forced to slave in his video game factory forever. He gets Banjo and Kazooie back in shape and gives Grunty a brand new body, as well as providing them with vehicles and a portal to the new world that he's created. This portal leads them to Showdown Town, a hub world filled with characters old and new, as well as entrances to the game's levels. It's up to Banjo and Kazooie to complete enough of LOG's tasks to unlock the door back to Spiral Mountain, where they'll face off against Gruntilda once and for all. Once again, the story is simple. It's still Banjo vs. Grunty, even with the new characters and locations to visit, with the plot taking a backseat to make room for the mission stories. Because of the mission-based design, the game puts emphasis on the storylines behind each challenge and the overall theme of each world, which I think works well. However, the quality of the writing is significantly reduced from Kazooie and Tooie. Tooie leaned heavily on sarcasm and dry wit, but Nuts and Bolts relies way too much on it. There is a point where cynicism becomes annoying, and that line is definitely crossed here. Too often the dialogue is just Banjo and Kazooie complaining about how uninterested they are in completing the current challenge, with little personality beyond that. There's some clever bits of dialogue and a good joke here and there, but something was lost in the translation from the N64 games to this one. Maybe that has something to do with the quantity of the dialogue, because there's a lot more speech in Nuts and Bolts. And since you're talking to the same handful of characters throughout the whole game, their dialogue gets old pretty quickly. You're still in control of Banjo and Kazooie as they adventure through the world, completing objectives and going up against Gruntilda. Banjo's moveset has been heavily reduced. The only moves he retains from previous games are jumping, swimming, grabbing ledges, and climbing. These all work basically as they did before, so you still have decent maneuverability. You can now also walk across tight ropes, assuming you're able to keep your balance, though this is never required to beat the game and is only useful for exploring Showdown Town. There's also Kazooie's magic wrench, which Law gives to her at the beginning. This is your only method of attacking while on foot, as Kazooie can swing it around while on the ground or in the air, and it also acts as an extension to Banjo's jump. The wrench can also lift objects, allowing you to carry them above your head. And it can also be used to respawn your vehicle at any time if you lose it, assuming you're not currently in a challenge. That's all you can do while on foot, and while Banjo still controls well enough, he's definitely not as agile or capable as he was in Kazooie and Tooie. But the reason Banjo's moveset is so limited is to emphasize the game's main mechanic, building and driving vehicles. You can enter and exit a vehicle at any time, and when you're piloting one, you can accelerate, decelerate, and steer as you would expect. If your vehicle tips over, you can easily flip it upright with the push of a button, and you can carry the vehicle while on foot with the wrench if you need to. While the vehicles you'll use during the course of the game look different and have different uses, the basic controls of each vehicle are always the same, which is great as it avoids the player getting confused with how a vehicle operates. But equally as important as controlling the vehicle is how that vehicle is constructed. You can visit Mumbo's Motors either in Showdown Town or via the pause menu, which takes you to a garage where you're able to build any vehicle you want. Every vehicle is constructed of parts that perform a specific function. At its core, a vehicle needs a seat for Banjo to sit in, a power source, and fuel in order to work. But depending on the type of vehicle you need, you'll want to configure your vehicle differently and add specific parts. A plane, for example, needs wings, a copter needs propellers, a boat needs to float, etc. You can use any part you have in stock when building a vehicle, and while you are limited in the number of parts you can use and how much space you have to work with, there's nothing stopping you from creating a vehicle that can perform any task you need. Your part selection is small at first, but gradually you'll gain more parts by playing the game, which means a higher number of capabilities for your vehicles. Building vehicles is also pretty simple. You have a three-dimensional grid that allows you to snap parts onto each other easily. You can rotate parts and delete them as need be, and if you need to move a part or multiple parts around, you can do that too. It's a pretty intuitive building system, and you'll get the hang of it within a few minutes. If you don't want to start from scratch, however, the game has some pre-built chassis which you can use if you don't want to create the foundation for your vehicle. The vehicle creation mechanic is honestly the best part of the game, and it's an aspect that I think deserves more appreciation than it gets. I know that a lot of Banjo fans can't stand the vehicle system as a concept, and I'll admit I prefer the old school N64 gameplay, but if you just look at it on its own, it's pretty damn good. It's easy to learn and provides numerous opportunities for you, and it allows you to unleash your inner creativity in a way that the other games can't do. I know the idea of vehicle creation and building your own tools seems pretty quaint now, but you need to keep in mind that this game came out 3 years before Minecraft and its imitators made crafting in-game items and objects seem commonplace. And it's one of the first mainstream examples of an in-game creation system alongside games like Little Big Planet and Scribblenauts. So in that way, the game is pretty groundbreaking, not as a way to rejuvenate Banjo's gameplay, but more as a way to focus on player creativity rather than concrete puzzle design. I will say that the vehicles you build in the early game all feel pretty slow and sluggish. Not just because the parts you have are so weak, but because you need to get a feel for how vehicles should be designed for maximum utility. If you stick with it though, you can build some truly awesome vehicles by the end of the game. You might not be able to wrap your head around the concept of Banjo driving cars, but the bottom line is, creating vehicles in nuts and bolts is fun. While in Mumbo's Motors, you can also visit the Testo track to test out your vehicle and see how it performs, as well as paint your vehicle a variety of different colors. Once you're done, you can save your vehicle, name it whatever you want, and then access it at any time when you're exploring one of the game's worlds. But what do you use those vehicles for? That's where the Jiggy challenges come in. In each world, you'll find a number of characters standing around, and they'll ask you to take part in a Jiggy challenge if you approach them. These are missions where you're required to complete specific objectives relating to whatever the character needs. Objectives will vary from mission to mission, including racing other characters, piloting your vehicle through a series of checkpoints, carrying an object to a designated place, defeating enough enemies or targets, and keeping an object or person alive until time runs out, among many others. The game is laid out so that each world will have different objectives for each mission, which helps keep the mission types from getting old. Although I was getting sick of races and carrying challenges by the end of the game. There are two challenge types, Player's Choice, which allows you to choose any vehicle you want, and Log's Choice, where you need to use a vehicle that's been built for you. When you enter a challenge, you're locked into it until you finish it or quit, but if your vehicle choice isn't working, you can leave the mission and choose another one. The majority of these challenges are timed, giving you only a few minutes to finish the objective, when you are then scored based on how well you performed. You'll earn a number of prizes depending on this score, earning notes if you just did okay, a Jiggy if you did well, and a Trophy Thomas Trophy, or TT Trophy, if you did really well. You can retry a challenge as many times as you want, and there's nothing stopping you from coming back to a challenge once you have better parts and absolutely destroying it. Really, the overall structure of the game isn't too different than Kazooie's and Tooie's, since you're still exploring a world looking for challenges that give you rewards. It's just that the missions here are more literal and the collection aspect is less explicit. Collecting the Jiggies in the N64 games relied not just on solving the puzzle of how to reach it, but also being able to execute the necessary platforming challenges. And that design philosophy still holds true here, even though it's in a different form. You need to solve the puzzle of what vehicle would be best for this situation, and then use your driving skills to see a mission through. However, while there was only one solution for the puzzles of the N64 titles, there's a lot more flexibility in how you can approach the missions in nuts and bolts. Let's say you need to carry an object from one area to another. You could use trays to hold the object inside your vehicle, but the object could fall out if your vehicle goes in a weird direction. Maybe instead you'll use a sticky ball that provides a tighter grip on the object, though it provides less protection and can affect your vehicle's momentum. You decide how you want to solve these challenges, and though each mission will be easier with certain parts, the method is ultimately in your hands. So you aren't railroaded into doing something a certain way. This doesn't apply to the Log's Choice challenges though, which are nowhere near as good. Most of the fun from the Player's Choice missions comes from building whatever you want to complete objectives. That obviously doesn't happen when you're restricted to a specific vehicle, especially when those vehicles are garbage. With some exceptions, the Log's Choice vehicles feel limiting, not just because you aren't able to modify them to your liking, but also because they often make tasks more difficult. In one mission, you need to pop a number of balloon-like germs that bounce around like crazy when you damage them enough. If you had a vehicle that could ascend and descend quickly, it would be okay, but you're forced to use this slow machine that uses balloons rather than propellers to ascend, and has limited ammo for its egg gun, forcing you to fly into these germs and poke them to death. The Log's Choice missions are frustrating not just because of the vehicles you have to deal with, but also because it goes completely against what makes the other missions enjoyable. Player's Choice missions give the player an opportunity to complete a mission on their terms through trial and error, which is inherently satisfying. But Log's Choice challenges are nothing more than a struggle for the player, trying to cope with difficulty that's been artificially imposed on you. I guess these missions were added to make the game harder, but they feel sloppily handled and are undoubtedly the worst part of the game. Finally, each world has a Grunty challenge, where you battle Grunty in one of her vehicles. These challenges are supposed to feel like bosses, but they can all be cheesed really easily if you have the right vehicle. And ultimately, these challenges are not well thought out, even the final boss. Your rewards for beating Grunty are parts which allow you to explore more of the hub world. You can't use any custom blueprints in Showdown Town. You're forced to use Banjo's default vehicle, the shopping trolley. The trolley starts out pretty poor, only letting you access a small area of Showdown Town. But when you complete a Grunty challenge, the part you win is automatically added to the trolley, and that part gives Banjo the ability to travel further into the town. I actually don't mind using the trolley in Showdown Town because any custom vehicle would snap the game in half, as they would allow you to access vehicle parts way before you're intended to, which would make these Jiggy challenges a complete joke. Not that you can't do that anyway, because if you want to get somewhere in Showdown Town that your trolley can't reach yet, all you need to do is place an object in the trolley that Banjo can stand on, preferably a box or large sheet, jump onto the object, and grab the trolley with your wrench. And suddenly you're floating in the air! You need to be careful not to fall off while floating, but doing this correctly will let you grab late game parts with ease, which isn't necessary to win, but is nice regardless. Now, despite the gameplay changes, the object of Nuts and Bolts is still to collect a number of items. It's only the method of collecting them that's different. Jiggies are still the main collectible, and once again they unlock new worlds. You don't collect these Jiggies straight away though. Every Jiggy you win is stored in a Jig-O-Vend machine located outside each world. Once you dispense a Jiggy out of these machines, you need to take them to the Jiggy Bank in the center of town, which then adds that Jiggy to your total. Getting a large amount of Jiggies to the bank without any of them falling out of the trolley is frustratingly difficult, but it is satisfying banking in a bunch of Jiggies at once. If you vend out a Jiggy but don't bank it within a certain amount of time, or you leave Showdown Town before doing so, that Jiggy disappears and goes back to the Jig-O-Vend machine. Which is helpful if you leave a Jiggy behind and don't feel like retrieving it or it falls out of bounds, as happened to me once. You'll also earn a Jiggy for every 4 TT trophies you earn, which is a good way to collect more Jiggies easily if you're good at the game's challenges. Notes are also back, coming in 3 varieties this time around. Bronze notes worth 1, silver notes worth 5, and gold notes worth 10. There are tons of notes in the game, and you use them to pay for services in Showdown Town. Also scattered around Showdown Town are Mumbo crates, which contain vehicle parts. You bring those crates to Mumbo, who adds the parts contained within to your collection. While you are given parts for collecting Jiggies throughout the game, it's definitely worth it to grab as many crates as you can. Most of them have parts that are really rare and or useful, and for some of the game's missions, you want as many parts as possible. The Jinjos are back as well, and there's 2 quests you can complete with them. First, there are 6 Jinjos who have been captured by the Showdown Town police, whom you can rescue and take back to their homes. Once they're home free, you can also find a Minjo, stun them with your vehicle or wrench, and then bring them back to a jail cell to lock them up. The main purpose for Jinjos, however, are the Jinjo challenges. There are a number of Jinjos hiding in each world, and they each have a mission for Banjo. These challenges include Jinjo Race, where you need to race the Jinjo from point A to point B, Jinjo Speed, where you need to reach a target speed, Jinjo Taxi, where you need to drive the Jinjo to a designated spot, Jinjo Fetch, where you need to find the Jinjo's lost object and bring it back to them, Jinjo Combat, where you need to push the Jinjo out of an arena without leaving it yourself, and Jinjo Hurling, where you need to launch a Jinjo far enough to reach a target distance. Beating a Jinjo challenge grants you a Jinjo token, which you can use in Showdown Town by talking to King Jingaling, who's the host of Jinjo Bingo. In Jinjo Bingo, you place down Jinjo tokens in order to fill the board and earn prizes, notes for completing a row, and vehicle parts for completing a column. You can earn a lot of notes by completing Jinjo Bingo, but most of the parts aren't that useful, so you can treat the bingo game as more of a side thing. Nuts and Bolts has the highest collectible count of any Banjo game, with 131 Jiggies to collect and more than 5,000 notes to earn, as well as 51 Mumbo crates in the hub world and 78 Jinjo challenges to complete. However, Nuts and Bolts also has the loosest item requirements to beat the game. In order to access the final boss, you need to bank 75 Jiggies, which you can reach before even entering the last world in the game. And you rarely ever need notes at all if your aim is just to finish the main story. They're really only there to access optional collectibles. So while there's a lot of content, there's also a sizable gap between just getting to the end as fast as possible and going for 100%. Which means you can pick and choose the missions you want to complete fairly comfortably. And of course, we need to talk about Stop and Swap, which makes its grand return in this game. If you have Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie save files on your system that have Stop and Swap items collected, you can unlock specific goodies for Nuts and Bolts. Unfortunately, it's difficult for me to verify exactly which Stop and Swap items unlock what, because there's a lot of misinformation about it online. And since I collected everything before playing Nuts and Bolts for this video, I couldn't tell which items correspond to each other just by playing, so hopefully what I'm about to say is accurate. For every Stop and Swap item you collect in Banjo-Kazooie, you unlock a special Mumbo crate that contains a unique vehicle part, which are entirely cosmetic, but a neat bonus nonetheless. You still need to bring these crates to Mumbo, but they aren't too hard to reach most of the time, and the game straight up shows you where they are once you unlock them. For every item you use in Banjo-Tooie, you earn a blueprint that you can access at any time, assuming you have the necessary parts and have the Logs Lost Challenges DLC installed. These vehicles are designed as experimental ideas rather than functional vehicles that will help you win challenges. And while some of them are technically impressive, you probably won't use them for more than a few minutes. Some believe that these blueprints are actually unlocked through Stop and Swap 2, the joke achievement system in the Xbox port of Banjo-Tooie, but this isn't true. I didn't collect all the Stop and Swap 2 achievements for these playthroughs, and yet I have all the blueprints, so I still believe Stop and Swap 2 does nothing and is just a gag on Banjo fans. The prizes you get for Stop and Swap and Nuts and Bolts aren't helpful for beating the game's missions, they're more like fun little bonuses for players of the Banjo series. You might interpret these as lame rewards, and if I'm being honest, I'm in that camp as well. But while these unlockables aren't great, it is cool to see that Rare was able to finally implement this feature, and it means that we can put the mystery of Stop and Swap to rest. Hopefully. Real quick, I want to mention that Nuts and Bolts also has a multiplayer mode that supports both local and online play over Xbox Live. You and your friend can compete in specifically designed challenges using either pre-built blueprints or vehicles that you've created yourself. The multiplayer isn't anything special, and unless you're using the game's vehicles, it can become completely one-sided if a player has the clearly better vehicle. I wouldn't bother with this multiplayer unless you're absolutely curious and everyone playing happens to like the vehicle gameplay. Back to the single player. Counting the hub world, there are only 6 worlds this time around, but they're much larger than any world in the series so far. Because the developers want you to travel with vehicles instead of on foot, each world covers a huge distance, and when you're in a vehicle, these level sizes make perfect sense. Don't even attempt to travel across these levels on foot, you'll get nowhere fast. The hub world is Showdown Town, a city manufactured by Log that's filled with several characters and has a number of districts to explore. Rather than being an isolated hub that only exists to contain level entrances, Showdown Town is an actual town with lots of stuff to do. You can chat with the residents, though they don't have anything interesting to say, and talk to returning and new characters who offer services in exchange for notes. Mumbo of course runs Mumbo's Motors, Bottles offers you gameplay hints, and Humbawamba has a store where you can buy specialty blueprints and vehicle parts. Boggy the Polar Bear, who's been in both Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie, runs a gym where you can improve Banjo's strength, running speed, and stamina. New character Trophy Thomas allows you to replay Jiggy challenges to get a higher score, and other new character Pikelet is in charge of the Showdown Town police. You'll occasionally come across police officers around Showdown Town who will attempt to hurt Banjo if they see you committing a crime, like smuggling Jiggies, firing a weapon, assisting captured Jinjos, or harming a police officer. However, you can bribe Pikelet with notes and the police won't come after you, which is not that exciting seeing as how the police are pretty easy to deal with. King Jingling runs Jinjo Bingo, as previously stated, and Klungo runs an arcade game called Hero Klungo Saves the World. This is a deliberately bad arcade platformer where you can only jump to avoid obstacles, and it's actually surprisingly challenging. While this was funny the first time I played it, the game does get old pretty quickly. It plays too slow, and even though it's only 5 levels long, it feels like it goes on for eternity. Captain Blubber is also here, and so are Mr. Fit, a supposedly athletic aardvark from Banjo-Tooie, who's also just here, and Jolly Roger, a former resident of Jolly Roger's Lagoon who now sells black market jiggies to Banjo in exchange for notes. although for some reason his name is Jolly Dodger in this game, which is either a reference to the Artful Dodger or Jammy Dodgers, or possibly both. Most of Showdown Town is optional and you can play through the entire game without exploring it at all, but I recommend that you do, if for no other reason than collecting the crates, which will make challenges much easier for you. Showdown Town is broken down into districts, which all have a unique theme, and there are convenient warpaths that allow you to get from one area to another very quickly. Just because of the sheer amount of stuff you can do, I'm prepared to say that this is the best hub world in the entire series. It's definitely the most fun hub world to explore, and it marks the perfect balance between open and condensed, plus I really dig the not quite modern town aesthetic. Now let's talk about the levels, which are set up like an open world sandbox game where you have large sprawling worlds that host the game's challenges. The worlds are split into different acts, which have their own Jiggy requirement in order to get in. Each act has their own Jiggy and Jinjo challenges to complete, but notes are shared between acts, so if you collect notes in one act, they'll remain collected in the others. The act structure prevents the player from being in the same environment for too long, which is a nice way to stop the game from getting visually stale. But going through every act in one world before moving on to the next, as I do, means the difficulty will frequently shift up and down. Act 6 of World 1 is much harder than Act 1 of World 2, for instance, because it's unlocked much later and features tougher challenges. So my recommendation is to enter the acts as they're unlocked, which can be difficult to keep track of if you open a bunch at once. As for the worlds themselves, the first is Nutty Acres, a typical grassland level featuring a coconut farm that also happens to be right next to a giant volcano. The early acts are more or less a tutorial, but there's a pretty wide variety of mission objectives. And it takes place in a big open space, giving the player enough room to get used to the vehicle controls and learn the layout of the world. It's definitely the best level in the game, and the one that most closely resembles a traditional Banjo world, so points for that. Next is Logbox 720, which takes place inside a video game console. This is one of the most unique worlds in the series just on its setting alone, but it's also one of the most difficult to navigate. Not only is the level built vertically, which I don't like, but the level is so claustrophobic that it's impossible to travel around in larger vehicles. But the concept is really great, with my favorite detail being the audio and video chips that temporarily distort the game if you damage them. I just wish the world itself were more fun. Banjo Land is the third world, and it's a giant museum dedicated to the Banjo-Kazooie series, and by that I mean only Kazooie and Tooie because the Game Boy Advance games do not exist. This is another awesome level. It has tons of Banjo memorabilia to interact with and exhibits based on several worlds from the franchise. You could argue that this is Rare just trying to capture the nostalgia of Kazooie and Tooie with empty reminders of the previous games, and maybe that's true, but I'm kind of a sucker for it. It helps that this world has the most varied missions in the game, though they can get pretty challenging by the later acts. Then we have the Jigazeum, a world that's all about sports. The sports theme makes perfect sense for a mission-based game, and it lends itself very well to the Jiggy challenges in this world. But the layout isn't anything special, it's basically just a giant dome that's 80% empty space, which makes this the most boring world in the game. Finally, we have the Terrarium of Terror, which features a garden of alien plants and species floating in a giant space station. The color scheme in this world is pretty unappealing, and it can be difficult to remember where each location is in relation to each other. And the challenges range from mediocre to awful, mostly because they're unnecessarily difficult. I get that this is the last world and it should be the most challenging, but many of these missions have frustrating stipulations on top of how hard it is to navigate. Once you have enough Jiggies, you can re-enter Spiral Mountain, which is a pretty faithful recreation of the classic level from Banjo-Kazooie. The only things you can do here are Log and Grunty's final missions. You start with a series of 6 challenges that you can only use one vehicle for, which means you need to design something that can handle everything. And in between these challenges, you'll face the most daunting and grueling challenge yet. A quiz show. You know the drill by now. Log will ask you a question and you need to answer it, but there's no time limit and every correct answer shaves time off of your score. So if you pay attention, you can almost guarantee yourself a trophy for these challenges. After that, you unlock the final showdown with Grunty, where she's built a series of vehicles and you need to destroy them in order to win. Once again, you're restricted to one vehicle, and if you arm yourself to the teeth and give it enough engines, you should defeat her easily. Banjo takes Gruntilda down and Log awards him the deeds of Spiral Mountain, while also transporting Grunty to his video game factory. The day is saved, Banjo and Kazooie get their old moves back, except not really, and Grunty's now forced to make video games for the rest of her life. Conceptually, these are some of the best worlds in the Banjo series. Because there's only a handful of worlds, Rare tried their hardest to make each world stand out from each other. And while the broader themes of each world may not be that unique, the story and foundation behind these levels are great. That said, the actual world design and layouts are a mixed bag. Some of them are fun to explore, but the others are either too open or too claustrophobic, and none of them capture the Banjo magic that you've come to expect. Not to mention that they don't have enough things to do to justify the large size, making them feel pretty lifeless. They work for the vehicle gameplay, and they are visually attractive for the most part, but the level design isn't as tight as the N64 games. Speaking of visuals, let's talk about the graphics, and in particular, the art style. Now, if we're just judging the graphical fidelity on its own, without taking the art direction into account, it looks pretty good for a 2008 Xbox title. The environments have a nice pop to them, and the color choices are usually pretty nice. And I like that Rare chose shades and hues that don't conflict with the colors of vehicles, so you can always distinguish your car from the terrain. However, the game's performance isn't always the best, and sometimes it's downright atrocious. The frame rate is strained a lot in some of these levels, especially if there's a lot of vehicle parts or objects loaded in. But when you talk about the graphics of Nuts and Bolts, you're usually talking about the art style. It still has a cartoony look, but the character designs underwent a controversial transformation. In Kazooie, the characters have rounded body parts, which produced a simple but pleasant look, but in Nuts and Bolts, the bodies are square, with harder edges and an overall boxy design. Many Banjo fans can't stand this art direction, saying that it's ugly and a major downgrade from the N64 style, and while I see what they were getting at, I think this critique is a bit overblown. I look at it on a case-by-case basis, and yeah, some of these designs are absolute trash. Banjo and Kazooie have some of the worst updates, which I think is the reason why the designs as a whole were criticized, because they're the most recognized characters. But other characters like Bottles, Captain Blubber, and Mr. Fit don't look too bad, and Gruntilda's new look, while a little different, is great. I won't defend the new character artwork as a whole, but I don't think it's 100% terrible. Plus, there's other aspects of the art style that are legitimately good. The terrain and environments have this patched together look, with stitches in the ground and smaller details like clouds in the sky hanging on ropes. It represents the idea that these are worlds created by Log specifically for this game, and he wasn't able to finish them in time without rushing a bit, which I think is pretty clever. The music is once again amazing stuff, and it's the first time the soundtrack uses a live orchestra rather than synthesized instruments. The N64 Banjo sound font still holds up today, but it is nice to hear actual instruments performing songs in the Banjo music style. It's also nice to know that Grant Kirkhope returned to compose this soundtrack alongside Robin Beanland and David Klinik, who worked on the music for Perfect Dark. The soundtrack consists of original tracks that incorporate melodies from the N64 games to, again, capture that Banjo nostalgia, as well as straight-up remixes. Both of which sound great and do a good job matching the environments they're played in. There's more of a focus on ambient sound design in this soundtrack, which I think is a nice way to update the Banjo music style while still keeping it in line with the N64 sound. However, I noticed that a lot of sound effects fail to play, especially when a lot of stuff is happening at once, so again, the performance of Nuts and Bolts is not its strong suit. That's almost everything covered, but believe it or not, Nuts and Bolts has some downloadable content known as Log's Lost Challenges. This is a new world that takes place inside the Testo track and contains a handful of missions. Each challenge has a Log's Choice and Player's Choice variant, and the Log's Choice vehicles were apparently designed by fans, which is pretty neat. But once again, these vehicles are more infuriating to deal with than they should be. The Player's Choice challenges have stricter score requirements than the Log's Choice missions, so you'll have to design top-notch vehicles if you want those trophies. If you're going to play this DLC, you should definitely do so after beating the main campaign, because you need late-game vehicle parts to stand a chance here. Other than that, the only other thing to do is play the sequel to Klungo's arcade game, Hero Klungo Saves the Universe. It has more features and a faster walking speed, and in addition to jumping, you also have a gun that can shoot enemies, but it's still the same cheesy retro throwback as before. The DLC only costs $5, and it does unlock the stop and swap blueprints, but it really isn't worth it unless you're a fan of Nuts and Bolts gameplay. The new missions are decent enough for fans, but casual players shouldn't bother. And that's Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, a game that honestly deserves more credit than it gets. The new art style can be off-putting, the world design isn't as tight as the N64 games, and it is lacking quite a bit of the Banjo-Kazooie charm. And yes, the gameplay is radically different from Kazooie and Tooie, but that doesn't mean the game is inherently bad. The vehicle building system is simple to learn, but allows for a lot of creative puzzle solving on the player's part, and the game doesn't completely ignore Banjo's collectathon roots. It's still, at the end of the day, a solid game that does a lot of things right, and while there is some questionable design, it is not a bad experience. So why does this game receive a lot of hate to this day? I think that Banjo fans hate this game primarily because of what it represents, or what they believe it represents. That being not only the end, tentatively, of the Banjo series, but also the end of an era for Rare. Several of Rare's key employees left the company in the years following Nuts and Bolts' release, and Rare went on to focus on Microsoft's Kinect, and we all know what came of that. In the eyes of many, Nuts and Bolts was the first big sign that the Rare they knew and loved from the Nintendo days was gone. And while the company seems to be heading in the right direction with the release of Sea of Thieves and the upcoming Battletoads remake, longtime fans will always miss the golden days of the company formerly known as Rareware. Having said that, I don't think it's fair to blame all of this on Nuts and Bolts. It may not have been the game fans expected or wanted, but that shouldn't disqualify it from succeeding on its own merits. Yes, it has cars. Get over it. The game is 11 years old now, and it's long overdue for a critical reevaluation because there's genuinely innovative design here that shouldn't go underappreciated. I've started to notice the conversation about Nuts and Bolts begin to shift, with some saying that it's a good game, but a bad Banjo game. And while I don't fully agree with that statement on a logical level, I believe that Nuts and Bolts does enough right to justify its place in the Banjo-Kazooie series. It's worth trying out at least, don't just fall into the hate train because it's so different from the rest of the series. I wouldn't recommend going for 100% like I would Kazooie and Tooie, but you should at least give the game a fair shot before you call it a bad game. And if you have played this game and hate it, I hope you at least understand why I don't think it's as bad as people say it is. It's included in the Rare Replay collection, so if you have that but have yet to see what Nuts and Bolts has to offer, you should definitely consider giving it a go. I gotta say, looking at the Banjo series for this retrospective has been quite an interesting time. I was worried that I would like these games less after examining them with a critical eye, but if anything, it just reinforced my love for them. The magic of the Banjo series, I believe, is that beneath its simple exterior lies a mechanical and design foundation that has a lot of depth to it. Banjo didn't invent collectathons, but it did help to solidify them as their own genre, and Banjo-Kazooie's influence can still be found on platformers to this day. Mario showed the world that 3D platforming was possible. Banjo helped prove that it could evolve into something wonderful. And even when the series went in new directions, it's clear that the developers cared about designing a game with fun gameplay, memorable characters, and plenty of worlds to explore. But what's next for the Banjo franchise? Most of Banjo's key developers have left Rare altogether, and several of them went on to form Playtonic Games, the studio behind Yooka-Laylee. And while it had a mixed critical reception, it showed that collectathons still have a decent amount of pull among video game fans. And of course, earlier this year, Nintendo announced that Banjo and Kazooie were coming to Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, making their return to Nintendo consoles after 14 years. If you have any doubts about Banjo's popularity, just watch the reactions people had to that announcement trailer. The pure joy that Banjo fans expressed at the news of its return, plus the response from Banjo's original developers, proves how much the fans love the bear and bird. While the long-term future of the Banjo series is still up in the air, just the fact that it's back in the spotlight now fills me with some hope that there'll be a new game eventually. But until then, we can always look back on these games and enjoy what we have, because franchises like this one don't come around often. And if you'll pardon the expression, they're very rare indeed. Special thanks to Dripson for assisting me with the multiplayer footage.